In a quiet suburban home in Windsor, Ontario, a small statue of the Virgin Mary stood on a shelf above a family's prayer altar. For years, it had been nothing more than a simple devotional figure, a gift from a relative back in Lebanon. But one cold winter night, everything changed. It began with a single drop. A tear-like bead of golden oil, glistening under the dim light, slid down from the statue's glass eyes and onto the family's open Bible below. At first, they thought it was condensation, or maybe a trick of the light. But when the mother touched it, she felt warmth, and a fragrance unlike anything she had ever known. It was sweet, pure, and strangely alive, like a mixture of roses and incense. Within days, the entire neighborhood was talking. People came to see it for themselves. Catholics, Orthodox, even skeptics with cameras. And soon those who touched the oil began to tell stories no one could explain. A child's fever disappearing overnight, a man with chronic pain waking up healed, and a young woman freed from years of depression after praying before the statue. Some called it hysteria, others called it hope. But for those who witnessed it, and for one man who had already lost his faith, what happened inside that small Canadian home would become the turning point of a lifetime. Because this is not just the story of a statue that wept oil. It's the story of what happens when heaven touches an ordinary home. The Haddad family had lived in Windsor, Ontario, for more than a decade. They were immigrants from Beirut, Lebanon, who had come to Canada in search of peace and a future free from the noise of war. Their modest brick house sat near the corner of Tecumseh Road, just a few blocks from St. Peter's Catholic Church. Marian, the mother, was a gentle woman in her 40s, kind eyes always with a rosary in her pocket. Her husband David worked long shifts at an auto parts factory across the river from Detroit, and their 10-year-old daughter Sarah was the joy that kept the family together. Curious, funny, with a laugh that made even tired evenings feel light again. Life was ordinary. They attended Sunday Mass, shared Lebanese meals after church, and kept a small prayer altar in their living room, a place where Mariette prayed every morning before sunrise. On that altar stood a small white statue of the Virgin Mary, barely a foot tall. It had been shipped years ago by Mariette's mother from Lebanon, wrapped in old newspaper and scented with olive oil. Over time, it became more than decoration. It was the silent heart of their home. Every night before going to bed, Mariette lit a small candle in front of it and whispered the same words. "Protect this house, O Blessed Mother. Protect my family." But by the winter of 2018, that sense of peace was beginning to fade. David had lost hours at the factory as layoffs spread across Windsor's struggling auto industry. Bills piled up, and anxiety crept into their once joyful home. Even their parish had changed. Attendance was down, young families were leaving, and faith seemed to be fading quietly into the background of modern life. Mariette still prayed, but sometimes, she admitted to herself, the words felt heavier, like they were falling into silence. One evening, as she helped Sarah with her homework, the little girl asked innocently, "Mama, does Mary still hear us?" Mariette smiled, but her eyes filled with tears. She wanted to say yes, of course yes, but she hesitated, because deep down, she wasn't sure anymore. Outside, the wind howled through the snow-covered streets. Inside, the small statue of Mary stood quietly in the candlelight, her glass eyes reflecting the flicker of flame. In that fragile home, between doubt and devotion, between faith and fatigue, something was about to happen. Something that would remind not just the Haddad family, but an entire city, that heaven had not gone silent. By February, the cold in Windsor had settled like a weight. David came home later and later, his shoulders heavy, hands stained with grease from the factory. Work hours were unpredictable, sometimes cut in half, sometimes gone completely. Bills waited on the kitchen table. Mariette tried to hide them under a stack of newspapers, but David always noticed. They argued quietly at first, about money, about the mortgage, about what God was doing or not doing. Then one night, the words got sharper. "Do you think praying changes anything?" David asked, slamming the fridge door. Mariette froze. He had never spoken like that before. "I'm just tired," he said, softer this time. "Tired of waiting for miracles that never come." She didn't answer. She just turned toward the little statue and whispered a prayer. But this time, even the candlelight seemed weak. That same month, their daughter Sarah began to fall sick. At first, it was just fatigue, then headaches, then fevers that came and went without reason. Doctors called it a viral infection. But weeks passed, and she only grew weaker. Marian spent nights sitting by her bed, holding a damp cloth to her forehead, whispering Hail Marys under her breath. David stopped going to church altogether. He said it was too hard to pretend. When the parish priest, Father Michael, visited one afternoon, David barely greeted him. "I don't think God hears us anymore," he muttered. The priest placed his hand gently on the little girl's head. "Sometimes," he said, "he answers in silence first." But silence was all they had. One evening, as snow fell outside, Sarah looked up from her pillow. "Mama," she whispered, "I dreamed of a lady dressed in blue. She was standing by my bed." Marian smiled sadly. "That's beautiful, sweetheart." "Maybe it was the Virgin Mary." Sarah nodded faintly. "She said, 'Don't be afraid.'" Marian didn't think much of it then. Children dream things when they're sick, but something about the calm in her daughter's voice lingered in her heart. That night, after putting Sarah to sleep, she went downstairs to the altar. The candle had burned down low. She stared at the statue, the white ceramic virgin with open hands and gentle eyes. And for the first time in years, she didn't know what to say. "Why her?" she whispered. "She's just a child." The room was silent except for the faint hum of the refrigerator. She wiped her tears and blew out the candle. Then, as she turned to leave, she caught a strange glimmer, a soft reflection under the weak lamp. It was as if a drop of light had appeared just below the statue's left eye. Marian leaned closer, squinting. There against the pale porcelain was a small tear-shaped droplet. Not water, but something thicker, golden, and faintly fragrant. She blinked, unsure if her eyes were deceiving her. She touched it. The surface was warm, and when she lifted her finger to her face, the scent hit her, a mix of olive oil and roses. Her breath caught. She whispered, trembling, "Holy Mother, what are you trying to tell me?" The next morning, she told David. He shook his head. "It's just oil from the candle, Marian. Don't start believing fairy tales." But that night, the tear appeared again, and this time, it wasn't alone. A thin line of golden oil ran down the statue's cheek, pooling near the base. Sarah, still weak, came to the altar with her mother and smiled faintly. "She's crying because you're sad." "Mama," she whispered. Marian's knees gave out. Something inside her knew, something beyond reason. From that night on, the house would never again be quiet, because what began as one drop would soon become a river of faith and controversy. Within days, the golden tears did not stop. Each morning, Marian found new streaks of fragrant oil running down the statue's cheeks. It soaked into the lace cloth below, glimmering under the lamplight. And the scent, that soft blend of roses and olive oil, lingered through the house long after the candles went out. Word began to spread. It started with a neighbor, then a cousin from Toronto, and before long, people were knocking at the Haddad family's door. They came with cell phones, rosaries, and tears of their own. Some brought small containers to collect the oil. Others just came to kneel. Marian tried to keep the house quiet, afraid that someone might think she was fabricating it. But every night, when she turned off the lights, the statue shone faintly, a pearly reflection, as if lit from within. Then came March the 2nd, 2018. That evening, Father Michael visited again, this time bringing 2 parishioners and a small vial. He asked Marian to let him observe the phenomenon directly. She agreed, her hands trembling. The priest placed the statue on the kitchen table under bright light. They prayed a Hail Mary together, and as they finished the words, "Holy Mary, Mother of God," a droplet formed under the statue's eye. It slid down slowly, shimmering like honey. No one spoke. The priest simply whispered, "Incredible." He reached forward, touched the oil, and brought his fingers to his nose. A faint smile crossed his face. It smelled like chrism, the sacred oil used in baptisms and ordinations. From that moment, the phenomenon became public. Local news outlets began reporting on it, first in the Windsor Star, then CTV News. Family claims Virgin Mary statue weeping oil. Church investigating, read one headline. Crowds gathered daily outside the house, singing the Ave Maria in English, Arabic, and French. Some knelt on the snowy sidewalk for hours, but it wasn't just tears anymore. The oil began to flow, covering the statue's face, hands, and robe. Sometimes it trickled down to the base, forming small pools that glowed under candlelight. The family collected it carefully with cotton balls, storing it in small glass bottles marked Blessed Oil. And then, the healings began. The first was a neighbor's son, a 5-year-old boy with a high fever that doctors couldn't explain. His mother, desperate, brought a piece of cotton dipped in the statue's oil and touched it to his forehead while praying the Hail Mary. That night, his temperature broke. By morning, the boy was laughing and eating breakfast as if nothing had ever been wrong. Doctors had no explanation. A retired mechanic named Robert Jenkins had lived 2 streets away. He suffered from severe arthritis, could barely bend his hands. He came one evening, skeptical but respectful. Marian handed him a tissue with a few drops of oil. He rubbed it on his knuckles and whispered, "If you're real, show me." The next morning he woke without pain. He could flex his hands freely for the first time in years. His wife cried as he drove himself to church that Sunday. And then there was Sarah, the little girl who had dreamed of the lady in blue. Her fevers had grown worse that week, until one night she could barely breathe. Marian knelt beside her, pressing a bit of the oil on her daughter's forehead, whispering through tears, "Please, Blessed Mother, if you are crying for us, let it be for her." Minutes later, the child opened her eyes, calm, smiling. The fever broke. By morning, she asked for breakfast for the first time in days. When Father Michael visited that afternoon, he found Sarah sitting on the couch drawing. On the paper, she had sketched a lady in a white gown with a blue mantle, her hands open, light surrounding her. "She's the one I saw, Mama," she said softly. She said not to be afraid anymore. The news spread quickly through Catholic circles in Canada, and the U.S. pilgrims began arriving from as far as Montreal and Chicago. They prayed, sang hymns, and collected small vials of oil. Some brought wheelchairs, photographs, even crutches, all hoping for healing. A camera crew from Toronto filmed the phenomenon one night. In the footage, the oil could be seen emerging directly from the statue's eyes, in real time, glistening under studio light. Scientists couldn't explain it. The material wasn't condensation, wax, or plastic residue. It was organic oil with traces of myrrh. Local police had to block off the street for safety as cars lined up along the block. Neighbors began offering tea and blankets to visitors waiting in the snow. Mariette's home had become a shrine, not by intention, but by grace. Through it all, David, once the skeptic, stood quietly at the doorway each night, watching people weep as they touched the statue. He had no words, only a slow, trembling faith returning to life. One evening near Easter, he found himself alone in the living room. The crowd had gone, candles burned low, and the house was still. He looked at the statue, its eyes glistening softly in the dark, and he whispered, "I'm sorry I didn't believe. Thank you for coming anyway." At that moment, a faint shimmer of oil appeared again, one single tear running down the statue's cheek, and for the first time in months, David wept too. By spring, the story of the weeping Madonna of Windsor had become national news. Television vans parked along Tecumseh Road. Journalists interviewed neighbors, doctors, even Father Michael. Every night, the line of visitors grew longer. Hundreds came to pray, to touch the oil, or simply to see what heaven might be doing in their midst. Mariette's once quiet home now looked like a small chapel. Candles lined the staircase. Pictures of the Virgin Mary filled the walls. Gifts from pilgrims who claimed healing or conversion. Yet through the noise and chaos, Mariette stayed humble. She never charged money, never sought attention. Each evening after everyone left, she cleaned the floors and whispered the same prayer. "Thank you, Blessed Mother, for visiting our home. Let your Son be praised." Within weeks, the Diocese of London, Ontario, opened an official inquiry. A team of priests, scientists, and theologians visited the Haddad home. They sealed off the statue, recorded temperature and humidity, and took samples of the oil. Their goal, to find a natural explanation. Father Michael was part of the team. He later described that night in his notes. No artificial source of oil was found. The surface of the statue was dry except where the fluid formed naturally. The odor was unlike any chemical or perfume. It was distinctly floral, similar to chrism oil. The lab analysis confirmed that the substance was pure organic oil with trace elements of myrrh and olive, but no chemical additives. Nothing in the material composition of the statue could have produced it. When the report was sent to the diocesan bishop, the conclusion read, "While no scientific cause has been determined, the event bears signs of supernatural origin. Further discernment and pastoral observation are recommended." The Church stopped short of officially declaring it a miracle, but it did not dismiss it either. And for thousands who had seen it with their own eyes, no official stamp was needed. For David Haddad, the event had changed everything. The man who once slammed the fridge in frustration now spent evenings praying the rosary with his wife and daughter. He said later during a small parish testimony night, "I used to think miracles were things from another century, but I watched one happen in my own living room, and I learned that faith doesn't begin with seeing, it begins with surrender." He kept a small vial of the oil in his coat pocket, not as proof, but as a reminder of grace. When co-workers asked if he really believed it, he smiled and said, "Go smell it for yourself." In July of that same year, on the feast of Our Lady of Mount Carmel, the phenomenon suddenly ceased. No more oil appeared. The statue dried completely, its eyes serene, as if resting. Some people were disappointed, but Marian understood. "She came when we needed her most," she said, "and when our hearts were healed, she rested." That night, as the family prayed together, a soft breeze passed through the open window. The candle flickered, and for a moment, the air filled again with the faint scent of roses. Sarah smiled. "She's still here, Mama," she whispered. Years later, the Haddad home remained a quiet place of prayer. Pilgrims still stopped by occasionally, leaving flowers and notes of thanks. The family never sought fame, and the statue, still gleaming faintly white, stood in the same place above their altar. Father Michael often said in his homilies, "God doesn't need grand cathedrals to reveal himself. Sometimes he chooses a humble house, in a tear of oil, to remind us that heaven still listens." And perhaps that's what the miracle truly was. Not the oil, nor the headlines, but the return of faith. In one man, one family, and one city. Sometimes miracles don't come with thunder or fire. They come quietly, through a single tear of oil, a fragrance of roses, or a whisper that says, "Don't be afraid." For the Haddad family in Windsor, that whisper changed everything. What began as a moment of sorrow became a river of faith that touched thousands of hearts across Canada and beyond. The Virgin Mary didn't appear to demand glory. She came to remind them, and us, that heaven still listens, even in our smallest prayers. In a world where faith often feels fragile, where churches grow empty and hope feels distant, stories like this one remind us that God still writes miracles in the margins of ordinary life. Maybe you've been praying for healing or for someone who's drifted away from faith. Maybe you've wondered if heaven still sees you. The story of the Weeping Madonna of Windsor whispers the same message Mary gave 2,000 years ago. "My child, I am with you. I have never left." Pause. Piano slows. Light choral pad rises. If this story touched your heart, take a moment to share it, so that someone who has stopped believing might find their way back to hope. And tell us in the comments below, where are you watching from and what miracle are you praying for tonight? We read every story and we pray with you. Don't forget to subscribe to AV Miracles for more true stories of faith, healing, and the love of the Virgin Mary. Because even in the quiet corners of our world, heaven still speaks.